Well, isn't this nice? I can't tell you how honored I am to be sitting here with these four individuals, these honorees. I've been asked to give some brief introductions, and then we'll have some time for some questions and some discussion about your careers and about opera. You know, if you think about it, these four people on stage here come from very different branches, so to speak, of opera. We have Martina Arroyo, one of the greatest singers of opera, Philip Glass, one of the most innovative composers of opera, David DiChiera, one of the most resourceful builders and directors of opera companies, and Queler, one of our most spectacular conductors. But those are just titles, really. They just scratch the surface of what these individuals have done for opera and for music. Martina Arroyo was a young student in New York in the 50s, really kind of just dabbling in opera singing, wondering if there could be a place for her in opera houses who were not hiring singers of color back then. But in 58, she won what was then the precursor to the Met National Council auditions today, which helped open doors to many opera houses for her in Europe. In 1959, she made her debut at the Met, a company that she would sing at for nearly 30 years, including a stunning Aida that you may have heard about in 1965, stepping in for Birgit Nilsson, who was ill. Martina became one of the great opera singers, certainly one of the great Verdi singers of our time, and what is great is that you gave back to opera in many different ways. Martina gave back in fun ways, like joking on the Johnny Carson show after singing arias like Un Bel Dì, also with her own foundation, which prepares students in complete operatic roles, prepares them for a career in opera. And she's served in many boards, and she's passed on her craft in a number of teaching capacities. A stint at the NEA Council of the Arts. She currently serves on a number of other boards, all in the service of the music that we love. David DiChiera, I have a soft spot in my heart for you because I'm a Michigan man, and I'm grateful for all that you've done for the struggling city of Detroit in the state of Michigan. Long before David built the Detroit Opera House to perform his Michigan Opera theater productions, we University of Michigan students used to trek up to the Masonic Temple in Detroit to hear the Met when they toured, and wondering all the time, well, when are we going to get our own opera house? Well, David rebuilt the Capitol Theater and opened its doors as the Detroit Opera House in 1996 with none other than Pavarotti and Joan Sutherland, alas, both gone now, there to cut the ribbon. That was in 1996. 2005, the opera Margaret Garner premiered at David's house. It was a DiChiera commission from composer Richard Danielpour and author Toni Morrison. But Michigan Opera Theater wasn't the only opera company that David founded and directed. He also created and led Opera Pacific in Orange County, and he also led the Opera House in Dayton, Ohio. Many more music and arts programs that he's founded and directed, including being president of Opera America. And if that weren't enough, David DiChiera is also a composer, and I believe even a premiere at the Kennedy Center here some years ago, and your own opera, Cyrano, premiered in 2007. So I think it's safe to say that you've been busy these years. Philip Glass has worn many musical hats, and a few of them non-musical too, like driving taxis and operating cranes. And we're fortunate that those occupations were fleeting, because otherwise we would never have Einstein on the Beach, this groundbreaking theater production from 1976 that essentially redefined opera as we knew it then. We wouldn't have the probing and passionate Satyagraha or Akhenaten or the 20-some other operas that Philip has composed, plus all of the great music for film and other ensembles and solo instruments. And I think crucially, we would not have as many young people in our opera houses and in our concert halls today. So, Philip, we are exceedingly glad that your taxi driving career came to a dead end. Philip, by the way, was raised in Baltimore, not far from here, and he got a good music education working in the record shop owned by his father, who lived long enough to see Philip's own records in the family store. Last but certainly not least, Eve Queller, along with Martina, the other native New Yorker here as an honoree tonight. All of us who love opera need to thank Eve Queller again and again and again and again. She has the sixth sense for sniffing out incredible young singers and great unknown operas. I mean, on a personal note, I had never heard the voices of Aprile Milo, Gabriela Benyatskova, June Anderson, Chris Merritt, Ben Hepner, maybe even Samuel Ramey before you presented them at Opera Orchestra of New York in its home at Carnegie Hall, where Eve has conducted some 100 operas in concert. Many of these are works that are rarely, if ever, performed or recorded. Many people never heard complete performances of Wagner's Rienzi, Tchaikovsky's Maid of Orleans, Meyerbeer's L'Africaine, Rimsky-Korsakov's Tsar's Bride, just to name a few, until Ms. Queller took them up. Puccini's Edgar and Boito's Nerone is probably a couple I'm forgetting. Both received their American premieres under Eve Queller. And as a result, some of these lesser-known operas have made very good footholds in the repertoire, like La Favorita and Rusalka. And this coming Monday, Opera Orchestra of New York opens its 40th anniversary season. So congratulations, Eve.
Thank you.
Eve has provided so many first-time opera experiences for many of us that it got me to thinking about the very first time that opera clicked for me. All of us opera lovers, we have a story about when the light bulb went off or when we got bit by that opera bug. So I'm curious to know, maybe we can go down the line here and tell us a story about when opera really clicked for you, when you fell in love with it. What happened?
Well, I was about 14 years old attending Hunter College High School, and the opera workshop of Hunter College used to meet in our auditorium. And at that time, the opera workshop of Hunter College was one of the best in the United States. It was one of the few that prepared young professionals, semi-professionals, and aspiring young artists to learn complete roles. We used to stand out as students outside and imitate them, which was lots of fun because, young girls together can be atrocious little beasts. And we were. And unfortunately, four of us were caught and made to go in and sing for Professor Joseph Turnau, who was at one time one of the directors at the Vienna Staatsoper. And instead of Professor Turnau giving me a good smack on my you-know-where, he said, are you interested in being a singer? And I said, absolutely not. I want to be a school teacher. And he said, well, sing something for me again. And I sang the Jules song, which I had learned off of a recording. So afterwards, when he said, what language was that? I thought, well, maybe I'm not doing it as perfectly as I thought. Anyhow, I started going to the opera workshop, and he sent me to my voice teacher, Marinka Gurevich, who remained my teacher for over 35 years. And I fell so in love with music. It was not only opera, but song literature and oratorio. I thought, this is it. I'll teach later.
David?
I was born in Pittsburgh, and my family, immigrant family, had no exposure to classical music. And I was the youngest of four, but I used to, on Saturday afternoon, I would always turn on the Met broadcast, and it made such an incredible impression on me. But I never saw an opera until we had moved, our family moved to Los Angeles. And I think when I was about 13, the San Francisco Opera, there was no opera company in Los Angeles at that time. San Francisco Opera used to bring opera for a week to the Shrine Auditorium. And one of the performances they always did was for school children chosen from the whole Los Angeles system, and I was lucky to be asked to go, and I still remember it. My first opera, Il Trovatore, and I remember even the artists, several of them quite famous, and so that was the beginning. I was just absolutely, I was hooked. It was something that I knew that I couldn't live without in some way or another.
So that proves all Italians don't love opera. Or know it.
Philip Glass.
Well, we had an opera company in Baltimore, but I didn't really see an opera until I was in New York. And that was as a student at Queler. And I remember very clearly, it was in 1957. I was studying composition. I thought, well, I better find out about opera. I didn't know very much about it. But at that time, the Met was on 39th Street. And for 50 cents, if you were a student, you could go and sit way up at the top. And literally, you looked, it was a little scary, in fact. You had a score desk, but mostly I looked down on the opera. And it was I remember very clearly the opera that really impressed me at that time. Some of you might remember, it was a production of Huizenga that the Met was doing in the 50s, and it was beautiful. I had been studying Berg as a composer, and I had been studying the lyrics suite and some of the compositions like that kind, but I had no idea that the emotional depth of his music could go so far. And that's when I saw the possibility of what opera could be. So after that, I learned about Verdi and those people later. I started off with that guy.
Did you ever think that could be something that you could do? You could put something like that on stage?
Never occurred to me. I thought it was just background for me. I became a composer of opera accidentally. I'll tell you about it sometime. But Bob Wilson and I did a piece together called I Sat on the Beach. We didn't even know what it was. But the only place you could do it was in an opera house because you needed a stage and you needed a proscenium stage and an orchestra pit and fly space. And we needed singers and we needed a chorus. And you could call Einstein whatever you wanted to, but the only place you could do it was in an opera house. So people began telling us, they asked us why we thought it was an opera, but we never thought it was an opera. But of course, that was a very provocative question. So we made up reasons.
Eve Queller?
Well, I started to play the piano when I was 5 years old, and I attended a public school number 64 in the Bronx, and there was a girl in my class who sang. And when we were 10, I invited her to my home to sing for my mother. I don't remember what she sang, and I played for her. And my mother said to her, "Someday you'll be at the Metropolitan Opera." And I thought, oh my God, Mother, really? What a gauche thing to say. This is Roberta Peters. Her name was Peterman, and she dropped the men. So we were 10, and 8 years later, I was standing room at the Metropolitan Opera when Roberta made her debut. She sang The Queen of the Night, and she sang Zerlina in Don Giovanni. I must say she had that voice when she was 10. The beautiful coloratura with the range and the expression, and it was just amazing. Through those years, I was listening to the Saturday broadcasts of the Metropolitan Opera, and I still had not figured out how I could connect with opera because I was practicing Beethoven sonatas. But every Saturday when they announced what was going to play the next week, I went out and I bought the piano score, and I started to study them and listen to them. And as I listened to the broadcasts, I went with a pencil and I wrote anything different in the score that was sung. And what I actually did, I was recording people's mistakes, thinking that was tradition, and I was getting all the tradition, the Mozart and the appoggiaturas and all of that. And as I continued in my wonderful, crazy love of opera, I began to realize that maybe I could accompany opera. And I started volunteering. By this time, I was at the Manor School. I volunteered my services in the opera workshop, and I played and learned some repertoire there. And then I presented myself to Julius Rudel, the New York City Opera, and he, miracle of miracles, hired me in his first season as music director. And that was a wonderful experience, a chance to learn the repertoire in a wonderful way with wonderful maestri. And very slowly it evolved that I started to conduct. I hadn't thought about that. I was very happy playing the piano for rehearsals, for singers. And it gradually emerged that sometimes they needed somebody to conduct a rehearsal on the 5th floor, and there was no maestro there. And then all of a sudden my name, instead of being under the maestro's name, it would be above, and there'd be another pianist there. And so voila, all of a sudden I was conducting, and it was a very gradual period until finally I was conducting on my own. But it was a very gradual thing. I have always loved the voice. I love the expression that the voice can do. The voice can change color. Can't do that on the piano. I mean, some people maybe can, but once we strike the note, you cannot change the tone. But when you hit a note as a singer, you can express with it. Yes, like she does. Wonderful. And so I fell in love slowly.
It's not always an easy path, but each of you took it, and that is the path of music, and specifically opera in most of your cases. It's no get-rich-quick scheme, really, and you've all had your struggles. I knew you were going to crack me up. Martina, you paid dues in small houses and small roles before making it big. David, you've had the financial headaches and responsibilities of starting opera companies from scratch and building them, keeping them afloat. Philip, you helped pioneer really a brand new style of music that did, let's be honest, did not fall easily on everyone's ears right away. And Eve, my goodness, you evangelized for operas that no one had ever heard of and put them on the stage of Carnegie Hall. So these struggles, my question is, what a life spent in music, what is it worth to you? Why did you choose this path? And for instance, if a young person would come up to you today and ask, how would you explain what makes your life spent in music worth it? Martina?
Well, if I had to explain it, I'd say go into nursing. When you want to perform and you feel that you have a talent, and by the way, I didn't really start in opera. I did many more recitals, song literature, and oratorios, which wasn't as known because they were small recitals in many cities in Europe and the United States. And you have to paint that picture. You paint a small picture just as you do in a big opera, and those colors must be clear and clean. But when you have a feeling that you want to perform, that's a feeling nobody can take from you, which is why it's so unfortunate when the opportunities aren't there, because there's so many wonderful, talented young people who will not have careers. That's the saddest part of all. So you must learn not only to pursue and fight for what you feel you can do, be grateful when you get it, and then turn around and say to some young person, come on, let me help you along too. But you know when you got it.
David?
Well, I can't imagine too many young people who are, caught by the love of opera or classical music, going into it because they think they're going to make money.
And let's face it, opera is not necessarily a music in an area that everyone just naturally gravitates.
Right. I think those who really have significant careers are driven to do that. They don't have an option in their own mind because it's so important to them. And I think that's what drives us, really. It's, we do, I've seen artists work for, and are really kind of hand to mouth. Sometimes we're lucky and they do make it, and sometimes they don't, but it's always that passion for what they are doing, and because music means so much to them. I do have a little story because I think it's kind of fun. When I was starting the opera company, I was in Michigan, but my parents were still living in California, and I was a professor at the university. And I went there for the summer, and I was working on the budget of this at the end of my first season. And it was like something like $150,000. But I lost, I think, about $40,000. And my mother says, Dave, I have to do my accent, what are you doing? And I said, well, Mama, I'm trying to start an opera company. And so I'm just going over the figures to see how we're going to make this. And she says, will you make money? And I said, no, Mama, we'd actually lost $40,000. And she says, I did all of this for you. I cleaned houses and so forth, so you can have your piano lessons and so forth, and you're losing money. I said, well, that's the way it is in opera. I said, the Metropolitan Opera this year lost $2 million. And she said, they lost $2 million and you lost 40? I said, yes. And she said, that's nice. So I had been validated.
Philip, what makes it all worth it for you?
Well, I began very early, still as a student at Juilliard, writing for theater companies and dance companies, because I asked myself the question when I was a very young composer, who wants my music? And I just discovered that dancers wanted it and theater companies wanted it. I didn't know much more about it than that. Eventually, within 10 or 12 years of that time, I began working in larger forms, and finally I began working on pieces that included singers and orchestras, and the reason I got attracted to it was because that's where everything was. That's where the orchestras were, that's where the choruses were, that's where the costumes were. Everything I was interested was in the opera house. The opera house is the grandmother and the grandfather of theater. It's where everything comes together. Text, movement, image, music. It's the earth, air, fire, and water. And to live at least a significant part of my life in that world has been one of the most, I can't imagine a happier way of living your life.
Eve?
Well, for me, it wasn't any struggle to do obscure operas. There wasn't anybody objecting to them, and generally the composers were known. And so if we do an obscure opera by Verdi or Donizetti or Bellini, people still knew something about it. Also, I had a predecessor in the American Opera Society where there were 5 or 6 years of wonderful concerts with Joan Sutherland came and Montserrat Caballé came for the first time. So there was some kind of a precedent that there was an audience, and I think there is a curious audience who is interested in what they don't know and what's unknown. And what I did is basically never thought about whether it was going to be difficult. I just was interested in the music and interested in making this music come to life and hopefully expanding on the opera company's repertoire. And every time I hear that maybe the Met will bring back Covancina and I did it first, or Attila and I did it first, I feel that maybe I had something to do with getting these works on the boards for a staged opera. And it's very inspiring for me to feel that I had something maybe to do with it.
You know, it seems like the annual gloom and doom forecast for classical music gets a little louder every year, and yet some people actually maintain that we're living in somewhat of a golden age of sorts, where more people have more access to more music than ever before, not only through the fact that we have a proliferation of performing ensembles, big and small, in the country, but of course also through the blossoming of the internet, where you can watch live concerts, download music, and you can go to a theater and watch a simulcast of the Met and other opera houses now. Taking all that into consideration, I'd like to talk a little bit about what you think the state of opera is today. And David, I would like to start with you. Opera is notoriously expensive. It's probably the most expensive thing to mount. I'm wondering, given the financial situations that many arts organizations are struggling with, can we afford opera simply today?
I think we have to feel that everything that has true value needs to be affordable. I think we have always lived in a culture, particularly here in America, where only things that make money have value. And we have to look at those things that are very important for the spiritual part of our life. And I mean that the enrichment of our, actually, of our lives is in terms of having what is very special. And I believe that there is always a way. We have big challenges, we've always had challenges in terms of public funding, because it's not a great tradition in this country, but we also now have challenges because we're in very severe economic hardships. But I think that opera has always had and will have a great future. Why? Because it includes everything. It may take many different kinds of forms. I mean, when you consider what our colleague here has done in terms of opera, has created works that have a completely different kind of approach, and it has a great following, particularly among young people. And so I don't believe in the other. I do believe, though, that there are challenges because, first of all, we have so many choices in our contemporary life in terms of, the internet, in terms of, radio, television, everything, so that the days where people just had a Thursday night subscription to the symphony or, a subscription to the opera, and particularly younger people, they do not really want to be kind of captured in advance. They often want to do things in a much more spontaneous way. And so you have to kind of work with that. It's the structure, I think, of both attending the arts and the support from it will constantly be in some kind of evolution. But I don't think that it means that it is the death knell of it. I think that we have audiences, as long as audiences are thrilled and moved by what happens on the operatic stage, I think there will be a very, very, lively and very active musical life.
Martina and Eve, I'd like maybe the both of you to talk to us a little bit about the state of singing today. It's always kind of tempting to pine for those so-called golden ages of the past, whichever ages those are.
The previous one.
Always the one before. What is the pool of talent like today, singing? I mean, you hear a lot of, Martina, you hear a lot of singers in your foundation.
Wonderful singers, wonderful voices, wonderful talents. Young people who are not afraid. They come out there and they're willing to do what they have to do what I was afraid to do as a young woman and didn't know that I needed to do, but now it's available to the young people. This is what you need to learn. This is what you might want to, how you might go further to consider it a complete performance, the character, the language, not only the voice. And these young people come up to the mark every time. And there's a surplus of wonderful talent out there. You have to find them. I know I've heard people say, oh, we don't have an Aida. Well, I've heard some Aidas. And I've heard some very good ones. They're not all skinny, but, but they have potential, and they have to be sought out and coached and trained and allowed to grow into the opera. You know, you don't just appear on the stage as a star, and sometimes that's what we're expecting. We have to grow and have moments that are not the most a failure. I don't mean failure. I mean where one isn't doing what one will do in the future with time and with experience. There's a lot of wonderful talent out there. I hope you feel the same way. I love working with the young people. I'm never bored, and when people tell me about the golden age, I go, yeah. I heard those people too. Now they're saying to me, oh, it's not the way it was when you were singing. Yeah. I remember that too. You know? So just wait out there, keep singing. When you hear the young people this evening, you'll know we're in pretty good shape.
Eve, how have you seen the talent pool of singers? Has it changed over the years?
It's changed, but they're there. I mean, there are terrific talents, terrific voices. I mean, when I listen to a voice, I judge some competitions, and there now, first of all, there are more foundations devoted to the nurturing of young singers than when I first started 40 years ago to conduct, and it's so expensive to prepare yourself for the stage, and now there's much more help, which is wonderful, because I hear the instruments. I think for operatic voices, you really have to start with the instrument. You can't really build it. I don't know if you agree with me or not, but you have to have something in there that's beautiful and cultivatable. And I do find that they're there, and I'm very excited about the younger, newer crop of people. I know I've found people like Dmitri Varstovsky and April Milo and Renee, particularly Renee Fleming, when they were just beginning. But the voice is there, and then the rest comes on it. And then we do have people today. Do not despair. We have great singers.
Philip, maybe you can tell us a little bit what you think about the operas of today. Do we still have enough of them? Are people? You're still writing them. Do we have enough? Do we have a stockpile?
Not just me. I have a copyist in New York who is so busy copying new operas that I have to get in line. He can be doing 6 or 8 new operas in a season, and that's just one person in New York. And I say, Bill, where are you doing these operas? And he tells me. He says, and he's acting as a publisher. He copies the music and he distributes it. And Bill Hollop, you probably know him. And his filling in a void, which developed because people didn't believe that this was happening, but people are doing new operas all the time. And one of the interesting things about it is that, when I was just starting writing operas, I scarcely knew anyone. I met Carlisle Floyd, but I hardly knew anybody who was writing operas. I also knew Virgil Thompson. Didn't know anyone my generation. Now I don't know anyone who isn't writing an opera. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Young people are interested in the kind of content that they can put into opera, political content, social content. They can talk about the world they live in. They can express things about their ideas about that world, the morality, the immorality, whatever, however you want to. And it's one of the things that's happening is that, especially for young people who don't have very much money, they may not even get to an opera house. They'll put together a group of people. They'll begin doing in small theaters, and they're basically dealing with opera. They're dealing with text, with movement, with image, and they're teaching themselves to work within the means. You say, well, opera is expensive, but it can also be very cheap. I did in between doing big operas, I did really tiny operas. I call them pocket operas. I would do an opera for 2 singers and a string quintet, The Penal Colony of Kafka. And that opera is being done a lot by small companies, little companies that could. I had an idea. If I could do an opera that you could take the whole set in a suitcase, and you could do it with 5 or 6 people. I said, could we do an opera in a living room? And people, the desire to write opera is it's very widespread and very deep, and it won't go away because they don't have the money. They'll find a way to do it, and then gradually, as they acquire the ability to do it, and they'll find people like our friends here to produce it and to work in it, and there is a generation, a huge generation. This is a golden age. I agree with that, and. A young guy that used to work, Nico Mully, he worked for me for 8 or 9 years as an assistant. He's writing an opera for the Metropolitan Opera now. And
We want to forget Mozart, though.
no, there are kids, and look, anyone under 50 to me is a kid. And there are kids out there who are really, and they'll just go ahead. They're not asking anyone's permission to do it. They're just going to do it. And from that sea of creative energy, I really feel we are going to emerge into a new period of flowering, not of opera, but of musical theater and musical language. One of the things that I remember, the advantage of being old enough, is that this country has gone through terrible crises. We went through it in the 50s. And what emerged after that was a huge flowering of painting and poetry and music. We're going through another difficult period now, for whatever reason it might be, or however you want to describe it. I am absolutely sure that there will be a generation of artists who are going to stand up and have something to say about the world they live in. And it's going to be a very creative group. I hope we can live long enough to see it. I'm planning on doing so.
Well, that is a good note to end. There's so many more questions. Look at all these questions. So maybe backstage a few. But before I break up this little discussion, I would just like everyone here to join me in thanking these 4 honorees for really dedicating your hearts and your souls to this amazing, yes, sometimes confounding, but always surprising art form that is opera. Thank you very, very much.